She buried her husband on a Monday. By Friday, a man she had never met was sitting in her living room, telling her she owed him more money than she would ever earn in her lifetime. He was her husband's brother. The debt was real, the signature was real, but the offer he made next was something no woman should ever have to hear. "Marry me," he said, "and I will forgive everything." She said no. She said it again and again for months. So he stopped asking, and sent a man with a knife instead. On a dark, foggy night, Isabella Aaron was being marched through the empty streets of the city, with a blade pressed against her ribs. She could not scream. She could not run. She had exactly 4 seconds before her only chance at survival would walk past her and disappear into the fog forever. So she did the only thing she could. She used the sign language she had taught herself while grieving alone, and begged a complete stranger for her life without making a single sound. This is a story about a woman who lost everything and still found a way to fight back without ever raising her voice. It will remind you that the most powerful thing you can do in your darkest moment is refuse to be silenced, even when silence is all you have left. If you can already feel the tension in your chest, I promise you, this story is just getting started. Subscribe now so you never miss a moment, and tell me in the comments, do you believe a stranger can change your life in 4 seconds? Let us find out. The cobblestones on Callum Street were slick and dark under the amber glow of old gas lights. Rain filled the cracks, reflecting a fractured sky that held no light of its own. A thick mist clung to the ground between the old, damp brick buildings. Their walls seemed to swallow every sound. In the distance, a car's headlights were a weak, golden blur in the fog, too far away to offer any hope. The silence of the night was not peaceful. It was heavy, and it was listening. Isabella Aaron walked carefully, as if the very ground might crumble beneath her. The hem of her deep green dress, which flared at her knee, was soaked from puddles she no longer bothered to avoid. She held a beige cardigan tightly across her chest, less from the biting cold, and more because her right arm was pinned. Her brown hair, once perfectly styled, was now frizzy and damp where the mist had settled. She gripped her gold-colored purse with her left hand, its worn strap a lifeline twisted between her fingers. Her eyes were puffy and red, a lingering sign of the tears she shed in her kitchen just an hour before. She had stared at a letter, reading it for the 11th time, and mourned a life that was now gone forever. Derek had shown up while she was still crying. He walked just behind her, his body angled to create a false sense of closeness without a hint of comfort. His dark hood was pulled down, hiding his face. His worn leather jacket reflected the dim light in dull spots and groaned with every step. From a window above, they might have looked like a couple walking home in silence, but their silence was not born of comfort. It was a cage. His grip on her elbow was a constant, painful pressure that said everything, and pressed against her side, just below her ribs, the cool, flat steel of his knife served as a silent threat. It was not cutting her, not yet. It was just there. It felt like leaning against a locked door, knowing someone was on the other side. Isabella had learned the rules of this game the moment he spoke to her on Grafford Road. She saw his hooded eyes and the hard set of his jaw, the look of a man simply doing a job. In the span of 3 heartbeats, she calculated the cost of screaming, of running, of reaching for her phone. The answer was one she hated but had to accept. So she walked. She remained silent. She tried to think. For 11 minutes, she had walked and said nothing. Her thoughts only led to one terrifying conclusion. Wherever Derek was taking her, whatever Matthias wanted, she would not be coming home. The street before them was empty, and then she saw him. He stepped out of the fog at the end of Callum Street. He moved the way some men do, with a quiet confidence, as if the world simply made way for him. His hands were relaxed at his sides. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that seemed untouched by the damp air, the collar of his shirt unbuttoned. Tattoos covered his knuckles and crawled up his wrists, disappearing under his sleeves only to reappear at his neck, the dark ink curving toward his jawline. His face was sharp, expressionless. His eyes scanned the street, not just seeing but assessing. He did not break his stride when he saw them. Derrick did not either. Men like him never yield to strangers. But Isabella noticed everything. She measured the closing distance, 15 feet. 12 feet, 10. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The sound felt loud enough to shatter the street's silence. She kept her head forward. Her steps did not falter. Her face remained a blank mask, the same one she had worn since Greyford Road. But her left hand, the one Derrick did not control, the only part of her that was truly free, began to move. Hidden from her captor's view, her fingers lifted toward her waist. In the single breath before the man in the black suit could pass them by, she made the signs. They were shapes she had practiced in the lonely months after her husband's death, a private ritual born from grief, never meant for a moment like this. Help me. He has a weapon. The man in the black suit did not halt at once. He took one more deliberate step, then stopped. He stood 4 feet away, a shadow in the mist, his tattooed hands hanging loose. He did not look at Derrick. He looked at Isabella. He saw her swollen eyes, her forced calm, and the rigid way she held her body, like a doll positioned with care. His gaze then shifted to Derrick's hand on her arm, noting the angle and what it meant about the man's other hand. He had understood her silent plea instantly. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost casual, as if pointing out a minor problem. Let her go. Derrick turned his head. He sized up Francisco Mora with a dismissive glance, already sure of the outcome. A smirk touched the corner of his mouth. Mind your business. Isabella felt the grip on her arm loosen for just a second as Derrick divided his focus. It was the only chance she would get. She threw caution away. She stopped thinking. She shoved. 6 months ago, Isabella Aaron had stood in a hospital hallway under the sickly glow of fluorescent lights. Everything looked wrong. The walls were too white, the floors too sterile, and the nurses' faces were too calm for the tragedies they passed. She listened as a doctor explained, in soft, careful tones, that her husband was dead. She remembered nodding. She could not remember what her own face had done. Thomas Aaron had been 34 years old. He had taken the same road to work every day for 6 years. The police report mentioned black ice and a guardrail that failed on impact. The official investigation took 9 days. It ended with a single page that used the word accident 4 times, but failed to answer any of her questions. The questions came later, when the raw grief subsided enough to let suspicion in. Why had Thomas stopped answering his phone 2 weeks before he died? Why had he been moving money into secret accounts? And why was there a man at his funeral, a stranger who stood in the back and watched the service like it was a business meeting? She did not know his name then. 3 weeks later, he came to her door. Matthias Aaron was Thomas's older brother by 11 years. He was a large man who dressed in expensive clothes, carrying himself with a fake smile that never reached his eyes. He brought white lilies, a flower for funerals, a gesture Isabella later realized was a deliberate threat. He sat in her living room, crossed his legs, and spoke of Thomas with a chilling ease that made her feel sick. He claimed they had been estranged for years, an old family dispute. He said he had wanted to make amends and was sorry he had waited too long. He was so very sorry. Isabella made him tea. She sat and listened, telling herself that grief makes people act strangely, that his appearance was just an awkward attempt to reconnect. She repeated this to herself over and over, until he reached into his jacket and laid a document on the coffee table. It was a loan agreement dated 14 months earlier, with Thomas's signature at the bottom. The signature was clear and definite. In the center of the page, a number so large Isabella had to read it again. Sure, she had seen the decimal in the wrong place. She had not. Thomas took a loan from me, Matthias explained. His tone was practiced, a gentle performance for news he had already shaped. We were not on speaking terms, but he was family. He let that hang in the air. He was in trouble. I helped him out. The plan was for him to pay me back. A calculated pause. He never had the opportunity. Isabella's gaze moved from the paper to Matthias and back to the paper. I knew nothing about this, she said. choosing her words with care. "I realize that," he replied with a smile. "That is why I came. I wanted to be open about it, to keep this within the family." She explained that she needed a moment to review the numbers, to consult with someone, to absorb the reality of the document. He agreed with a generous nod. He collected his flowers, let himself out, and urged her to take as much time as she required. His first call came the next Tuesday. He called again the following Tuesday. The third time, he called on a Thursday, so late the living room was already dark. His voice sounded the same as it had in her house, calm and almost kind. But something cold was beneath the surface now. It felt like a winter draft from an unseen, open window. "I have an idea," he said, "a way to solve this for everyone." She stayed silent. "Marry me," he proposed, "and we can consider the matter closed." A long quiet stretched across the line. In that silence, Isabella knew he was serious. She knew he felt no remorse, and she realized that every part of his visit, the flowers, the gentle voice, the relaxed way he sat, had all been designed to lead to this very moment. "No," she answered. He accepted her refusal with a calm that was far more terrifying than rage. "You should consider it," he advised. "There is no rush." But she did not want more time. She just wanted the calls to cease. The calls did not end. Instead, he started showing up. He would be at her door as evening fell. He would be in the parking lot of the small office where she worked twice a week. One time, he materialized at the far end of an aisle in the grocery store, holding a shopping basket and smiling like it was a chance meeting. Then came the other men, strangers who started lingering near her home. They were not openly hostile. They did not make threats. They were just there, watching. During one visit, he stood in her doorway, his hand braced against the frame. "You are part of this family," he said. "You cannot just leave us." She repeated her offer. She would pay back the loan over time, no matter how long it took. He let out a soft laugh, which was more disturbing than anger. "This was never about money, Isabella." It was then she finally grasped the truth. There would be no deal. The paper on her table had never been about a loan. It was a claim. The debt was just his excuse to claim ownership of her. Trapped by a debt that felt like a cage, she made her plans in secret. She would find a new city and a different apartment. She would leave no trace for him to follow. She gave herself 3 weeks to become a ghost. She confided in no one. Her escape happened on a Wednesday, before the sun came up. She carried only what she could fit into 2 bags. The rest of her life, the furniture, the drapes, everything that defined her past, was left behind. It was a life she could not take with her. She had held on to a single desperate hope, that getting far away would keep her safe. Tonight, after walking for 11 minutes down Callum Street, she finally knew it had not worked. Francisco Mora was not supposed to be on Callum Street. His plan was to use Grenville Road, a wider and brighter street that would have saved him 3 minutes. The problem was a bar on Grenville Road. At this time of night, it had a front door he needed to avoid. 2 men he had unresolved issues with were probably inside drinking. Francisco knew from experience that old troubles have a habit of exploding when you walk by them. He always chose the time and place for his own conflicts, so he took Callum Street. Only later would he reflect on that choice. He would think about the simple, ordinary reason for a small turn that changed the course of everything. Francisco was 38, but he seemed older to most. It was not his face, which was thin and smooth. It was his presence. He had a profound stillness. He filled a space like a stone building, solid and permanent. He lacked the nervous energy that makes other men shift their hands or scan a room. He was a little taller than 6 feet. He wore a tailored black suit with natural comfort. It was not for show, it was a statement. He understood clothes send a message before you ever speak. He wore no tie. The top button of his dark shirt was undone. Tattoos covered his hands and ran up his neck. They were not for style. They were a map of his history, earned in certain circles with certain kinds of people. Every mark held a story. He never shared it with outsiders, and he never had to explain it to insiders. His influence covered a large part of the city's unofficial business. He dealt in loans, real estate, and shipping that operated in the shadows of the law. You would never see his name in the news or a police report. He was the man whose name was spoken in whispers. People mentioned him when they needed to explain why a problem had quietly vanished. He lived by a strict, simple code. He did not tolerate needless violence. He left innocent people out of his affairs. And he had one unbreakable rule: no woman would ever be harmed. Not for any price, not for any reason. That last one was not business. It was deeply personal. Camila Mora was born on an October Tuesday. She was the seventh child in a family with almost nothing, a family that shared what little it had. Francisco was 12 years old. He could still recall standing in the doorway of his mother's room after the birth. He saw the tiny, wrinkled, angry face of his new sister, and a feeling took root inside him. He did not know its name then, but he would later. It was responsibility. When Camila was 8 months old, they learned she was deaf. The doctor called it profound hearing loss. That one word, profound, stayed with Francisco for days. It sounded more like a final judgment than a medical fact. At 15, he made a choice. The world had forced his sister into silence. He decided he would learn to speak her language. He bought books. He located a teacher just a few blocks away who gave him lessons for 2 hours each Saturday. He paid for the lessons by moving boxes in her storeroom. At night, he would practice. His hands made shadows in the dim light of the room he shared with his two brothers. The shapes slowly turned into signs, the signs into sentences. Soon he was fluent. He could make his sister laugh with just his hands. Francisco was 19 when Camila was killed. It was called an accident, but it was not that simple. It was the kind of accident that happens when a predator corners a young deaf woman on a dark set of stairs because she cannot hear him coming. The police investigation was short. The case was closed. The city had bigger problems to solve. But Francisco never closed the case. He tucked the memory away, a sharp object hidden deep inside him that he could always feel. That memory shaped his entire life. It was the reason for his code. It was the source of the coldness in his gaze when someone broke his rules. It was why his hands sometimes still formed the old, familiar signs. It was a habit he was not even aware of. And it was why, on this damp Wednesday on Callum Street, he saw everything. He saw a woman in a green dress lower her hand to her side. He saw her form two quick, precise sentences with her fingers. And Francisco Mora understood every single word. He had noticed them from 30 feet away. Nothing looked obviously out of place to a normal person. Derek was skilled enough to make sure of that. But Francisco observed people differently. He read the language of the body, and Isabella's body was screaming a message that contradicted everything else. Her shoulders were tense and drawn in. Her walk was unnaturally rigid, the careful pace of someone fighting for control. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, missing the details of the street. She was not taking a walk. She was being forced to walk. The man behind her, Derek, wore a large, worn leather jacket. His right arm was held at an angle that was wrong. It was not the relaxed hold of a companion, it was the grip of a captor. Her posture communicated a hidden agony. It was a familiar angle to Francisco. He absorbed every detail in the time it took to cross 15 feet. Then he saw her hand move. His body understood what was happening an instant before his conscious mind caught up. Her fingers formed the first word, and a profound silence settled inside him. It was the quiet that always preceded focused action. "Help me." He took one more stride. The second phrase took shape against the dark fabric of her skirt. "He has a weapon." Francisco stopped cold. He looked at her face, but this time he truly saw it. The swollen eyes, the rigid, empty expression of a woman who had mastered the art of wearing her terror quietly. He saw the way she gripped her handbag like it was her last connection to a normal life. An old, deep-seated feeling stirred within his chest. He shifted his gaze to Derek. Derek had already sized him up and written him off. It was the arrogant, snap judgment of a man who sees a stranger as an irrelevant detail. That was his first error. When Francisco spoke, his voice was almost gentle. "Let her go." Derek let out a short, contemptuous laugh. It was a sound designed not for amusement, but to establish dominance. A man like Derek used that sound to tell you that you had completely misunderstood who was in charge. "Walk away," Derek said. His voice was low and steady, filled with the certainty of a man who had never faced a consequence that mattered. "This has nothing to do with you." Francisco did not budge. He stood there in the golden glow of the street lamp, his hands hanging loose, his tattooed fingers at ease. His face held the same unreadable calm it had since he turned onto Callum Street. He was not faking it. He was calm the way a deep ocean is calm, its surface still while immense power moves below. "I am making this my business," Francisco said softly. Derek's jaw tightened. His grip on Isabella's elbow adjusted, a small, involuntary reaction. It was the twitch of a man trying to manage two problems at once, unsure which one to prioritize. His right arm, the one pressed against Isabella's side, was motionless. The knife did not move, but his eyes darted to Francisco. That was the mistake. It was not the only one he would make that night, but it was the first. Isabella felt his grip change. It was like feeling the slightest give in a tight rope, barely perceptible, but real. She had been monitoring it for 11 minutes. The precise amount of pressure on her elbow, how it changed when he was focused on her versus when his attention shifted elsewhere. With a patience born of sheer desperation, she had waited for a change big enough to act on. This was it. She stopped thinking. Thinking was what she had done for 6 months. Exhausting, careful, measured thoughts had brought her to a new city, a new apartment, a new life, and had delivered her to this foggy street with a blade at her ribs. Thinking was not enough anymore. She threw her left shoulder back, driving it into Derek's chest. It was not a powerful move. She was not a powerful woman. It was the sudden, committed act of someone who knew the next 5 seconds would decide everything. Derek's hold broke. Not entirely. His fingers scraped down her sweater as she threw herself forward, yanking the material sideways. She heard him make a noise of surprise, not pain. Then she was stumbling forward 2 steps and spinning around. The knife was no longer touching her. The entire exchange took less than a second. Francisco was already closing the distance before she was fully free. He did not run. He moved in 3 long, efficient strides with no wasted energy. By the time Derek processed that Isabella had broken away and turned his attention forward, Francisco was already in his personal space. He caught Derek's knife hand by the wrist. The hold was not about strength, it was about anatomy. He pressed 2 fingers into the weak point where tendon meets bone. He rotated his hand inward and down, using Derek's own momentum and a law of physics that he was helpless to fight. Derek's arm buckled. His hand opened on its own. The knife fell from his grasp and hit the wet cobblestones. The sound it made was surprisingly quiet for something that had defined the last 11 minutes of Isabella's life. It spun once and landed in a puddle. But Derek was not finished. He threw a clumsy punch with his free arm, a wide, reactive swing. Francisco stepped into it, letting the blow glance off his shoulder as he drove his forearm into Derek's chest. The impact was precise. It was enough. Derek's back hit the brick wall with a force that drove the air from his lungs in one sharp gust. He slid down, his hood fell away. His face, now visible in the lamplight, was broad and rough. It showed an emotion he probably had not felt in a long time. Confusion, followed by pain, followed by a swift and total darkness as Francisco's elbow made contact with his jaw in a final, clean motion. Derek collapsed onto the wet stones and did not move. The street fell silent. It was not the tense silence from before, but something empty and calm, as if the night had held its breath for 11 minutes and could now exhale. Fog drifted between the lights. The distant headlights were still there. The only sound was the irregular drip of water from a gutter somewhere above. Francisco smoothed out his jacket. He looked down at Derek for 2 seconds, not with triumph, not with any emotion at all, but with a clinical assessment. Then he turned. Isabella was still there. She stood 4 feet away on the slick street. Her green dress was damp and twisted where Derek had grabbed her. Her beige sweater was pulled from one shoulder, and she still held her handbag with both hands, as though it was an anchor in a world that had just been thrown off its balance. Her breathing was quick and shallow. Her eyes, already red from crying earlier that evening, were wide and fixed on Francisco. She was looking at him the way you look at something you cannot understand. It was not fear. It was not relief. It was something in between, an emotion that had not yet found a name. Francisco slowly raised his hand and signed, "You are safe." 2 words, simple movements, formed with the same deliberate precision he used for everything. His tattooed fingers moved clearly in the yellow light, making sure she could see each sign. Something on Isabella's face fractured. It was not a gentle break. It was not the way relief is supposed to creep in slowly like light filling a room. It was the way things shatter when they have been held together for far too long. Her shoulders slumped first, and then her chin dropped. A sound came out of her that was not a word and not a cry. It was something more raw, something that had been squeezed into a tiny space for a long time. She wept, standing right there on Callum Street in the damp air. Her green dress was soaked at the hem, and her handbag hung from fingers that had finally loosened their grip. Isabella Aaron wept with the absolute messy release of a woman who had used up the very last of her strength. Francisco did not look away. He did not mind the quiet. He just waited, a still, steady presence, as the night held them both. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with no name on the door and no number you could see from the street. Francisco had 3 such places in the area. They were not safe houses in the dramatic sense, not rooms filled with supplies or escape plans. They were just quiet spaces, unremarkable. The kind of place addresses that did not appear in conversations. He chose this apartment for Isabella because it was the closest one he knew. It was a simple, pragmatic decision. She never questioned where they were headed. She had simply walked next to him from Callum Street, making 2 turns and passing through a narrow alley between buildings. She moved with the quiet acceptance of a person whose body now followed new instructions without question. He observed this, but remained silent. There would be time for words later. The apartment was warm, with simple furniture. There was a table with 4 chairs, a sofa the color of dark stone, and a kitchen. Francisco immediately filled a kettle and turned it on. He did not ask if she wanted anything. In his experience, people who have been cold and terrified for an hour need something warm to hold before they need anything else. Isabella took a seat at the table. The crying had stopped on Grenville Road, not because the feeling was gone, but because she had hit the wall of a unique exhaustion that lies beyond tears. Her eyes were now dry and very still. She had placed her handbag on the table directly in front of her, with both hands resting flat on the surface beside it. It was as if she needed to confirm the table was solid. Francisco put a mug down for her, sat in the opposite chair, and said nothing. She looked at him for a long time, at the tattoos covering the hands that rested on the table. She noticed the calm, patient quality of his focus. He wasn't watching her like someone who expected her to feel better on a specific timeline. He was just there, present in a way that showed he understood that silence is not a vacuum that always needs to be filled. She lifted the mug, held its warmth, and then she started to speak. She talked about Thomas first. She did not call it an accident, not tonight. She was not ready for that word. Not after all this. She spoke of Thomas as he was, a quiet man who brewed coffee that was too strong, who always forgot to buy more milk, and who had a habit of reading 3 books at the same time. He would leave them open, face down, on every flat surface in their home, until she complained so often that it became a running joke between them. Then it became a memory she could not revisit without paying a price. She described the hospital hallway, the doctor's carefully chosen words, and the way she nodded her head, an action she still could not recall. She told him about the loan papers on the coffee table, and Matthias sitting there, his ankle casually crossed over his knee. She told him about the marriage proposal, spoken in that same careful tone, as if it were just a logical, businesslike answer to a math problem. She told him about the phone calls, the visits, and the men who started showing up near her home. She told him about standing in her own doorway and hearing the words, "You belong to this family," and knowing with a certainty that felt physical that no version of staying here would end well for her. She told him about the new apartment, the 2 bags she packed, the Wednesday morning she left in the darkness. She told him about tonight, about the voice that commanded her to walk. She spoke of the 11 minutes on Callum Street when she debated whether she was going to fight to survive or just endure what was coming. Through her entire story, Francisco never interrupted. He did not lean forward with the fake attentiveness of someone trying to prove they are listening. He just listened. He absorbed every word with the same stillness he held in his body. His dark eyes stayed on her face, and his tattooed hands remained quiet on the table that separated them. When she was done, the kettle was long cold. Her mug was empty. The apartment was silent. Francisco waited a moment more. Then he said, "I will handle it." 4 words. There was no detailed plan, no list of actions, no guarantee of what handling it actually meant. It was just a statement, placed on the table between them as plainly as he had placed the mug. Isabella looked at his face and knew, with the sharp instinct of a woman who had learned for 6 months to see the truth behind what men say, that those 4 words were exactly as they seemed. They were not a performance. They were not the start of a negotiation. They were a fact about what would happen next. She gave a single nod and looked down into her empty mug. "I do not know why you are doing this," she said softly. Francisco thought about her question with the gravity it deserved. "You asked," he finally said. She looked up at him. He made a small motion with his right hand, the familiar old shape, the sign she had made on Callum Street. She understood he meant it literally. She had asked for help in the only way she could at that moment, and he had answered. That was his entire reason. She found she had no way to argue with it. In another part of the district, in a room above a dry cleaning shop on Pemworth Street that was the command center for Matthias Aaron's various enterprises, Derek woke up on the floor of a car. It smelled of cigarettes and old fabric. His jaw throbbed with pain, and his wrist felt even worse. The driver did not ask him how he felt. He asked what happened. Derek explained it all in the broken, painful sentences of a man with a jaw that barely worked. He pieced together everything he could remember from those 11 minutes on Callum Street. The woman, the man in the black suit, the speed of it all, the chilling, precise efficiency with which they had lost complete control. The driver did not speak. He just drove. Matthias was waiting in the room above the dry cleaners. He sat behind a desk that was too big for the room, a detail that Francisco would have immediately understood was a deliberate choice. He listened to Derek's story with his fingers woven together on the desk. His face held the specific expression of a man who is calculating his reaction instead of just reacting. When Derek was finished, Matthias was silent for a second, and then he laughed. It started as a short burst of sound but grew until it filled the entire room. It was the honest laugh of someone who has just heard something utterly ridiculous. A woman, a total stranger on the street, his own men taken down by a widow in a green dress who decided to get a random person involved. He shook his head and took a breath, about to say something dismissive, and then Derek said the name. The laughter cut off. Matthias's hands, still clasped on the desk, tightened so slightly it was almost invisible. The feeling in the room seemed to shift. Or maybe it was just the nature of his attention that shifted, hardening into something far less entertained. "Say that again," Matthias said, his voice low. Derek said it again. Matthias unlinked his hands and placed them flat on his desk. He stared at the space between them for a long moment, reevaluating a situation that had seemed perfectly simple just 30 seconds before. As it turned out, the situation was not simple at all. The dry cleaning business on Pemworth Street opened at 8 in the morning and closed at 6 in the evening. In the 11 years that Matthias Aaron had used the room above it as his base, no one had ever shown up without an invitation. Francisco Mora arrived at 10 the next morning. He did not knock. He did not call ahead. He walked straight through the front of the shop, past the clothes in plastic bags turning slowly on their rack. He walked past the woman at the counter, who glanced up and then immediately looked back down with the learned indifference of someone who knew some visitors were not her business. He went up the narrow stairs at the back of the shop without stopping. The guard posted at the top of the stairs put a hand on Francisco's chest. Francisco looked down at the hand, then up at the man. The man took his hand back and stepped out of the way. Francisco opened the door. The room was just as he had imagined. A large desk was positioned to assert power. 2 chairs were set at a distance meant to feel just a little too far away, close enough to talk, but far enough to establish who was in charge. A window behind Matthias's chair would put his own face in shadow while lighting up the person sitting across from him. These were the details put together by a man who had read books about power but had mistaken reading for true understanding. Matthias was on his feet when Francisco walked in. This was a change of plans. Francisco could see he had meant to be sitting, but the name had clearly thrown off his prepared scene. He was bigger than Francisco, heavier, with dark hair that was turning silver at his temples in a way he probably thought made him look important. He wore an expensive, tailored charcoal suit. It announced his wealth so loudly that it hinted he was not sure it could speak for itself. His eyes, as they locked on Francisco, were the eyes of a man trying to size someone up while pretending he was not. "Francisco Mora," he said. It was a statement, not a greeting, meant to show he knew the name, that this arrival was not a complete surprise. "Matthias," Francisco replied, using only his first name. He said it quietly, the way you name something that does not impress you. He walked across the room without waiting for an invitation to sit. He pulled one of the chairs a foot closer to the desk, a small, slow adjustment, and sat. He put an envelope on the desk in front of him but did not slide it forward yet. He left it sitting there between them, a fact waiting to be addressed. Matthias sat down. He glanced at the envelope, then back at Francisco. "You put one of my men in the hospital," he said. "Your man put a knife to a widow's ribs," Francisco replied. "On a public street, at night." He let that statement hang in the air for a moment. This entire arrangement felt wrong. A muscle in Matthias's jaw tightened. "She has a debt, and she made an offer to pay it. But the terms were altered." "You altered them without her consent," Francisco stated. "That is not how a debt is collected. That is how a person is owned." He paused. "The two are not the same." Matthias settled back into his chair, folding his hands on the desk. It was the same gesture Dererick had seen him use the night before, a fact Francisco did not know and would not have cared about. "You have spoken with her." "I have." "Then you have the complete story." "I have her story," Francisco corrected. "I came here for yours." The directness seemed to catch Matthias off balance, as did the lack of anger he had been expecting. He sized Francisco up for a second, readjusting his approach. "My brother owed me a great deal of money. He passed away before we could settle. That debt falls to his estate," Francisco said, "not to his wife's body." A deep silence filled the room. Matthias produced a smile. It was the smile of someone choosing to see charm instead of a threat, because the alternative would force a feeling he refused to acknowledge. "You are here to make a deal. I am here to end one." Francisco slid an envelope across the desk. Matthias let it sit for a moment. He eyed it with the practiced calm of a man who never shows his hand until he knows if it is a winning one. Finally, he picked it up, broke the seal, and examined the contents. It was not the amount he had anticipated. An expression briefly crossed his face. It was not gratitude or relief, but the small, involuntary twitch of a man whose careful calculations had just been disrupted. He placed the envelope back down. "This covers the principal," he stated. "And the interest," Francisco added. "I had the full amount calculated by a third party. The number is correct." Matias stared at him. "You had it calculated yesterday evening." Another quiet moment passed. Matias tapped the envelope with 2 fingers. Then he leaned in, and the smile reappeared. This time it was different. It was stripped of any pretense of warmth, revealing its true, much colder nature. "You are a man of action, Francisco. I can appreciate that. But there is a fundamental piece you are missing." He let the words hang in the air. "This stopped being about money a very long time ago." "I am aware," Francisco said. "That is what worries me. She is Thomas's widow. Her place is with this family." "Her place is her own," Francisco replied. His words were soft and plain, with no anger behind them, which made them hit with more force than a shout ever could. "She does not love you. You cannot bargain for emotion. You cannot claim it like a debt, and you cannot dispatch men with knives to go and retrieve it for you." Matias's face became a cold, hard mask. "The act was finished. You are getting involved in something that will cost you far more than what is in that envelope." "Perhaps." Francisco rose to his feet, adjusted his jacket, and looked down at Matias. His gaze was calm and clear, the look of a man who has measured a threat and filed it away. "Leave her be. The debt is paid. This is over." He turned and walked toward the door. "If you walk out of this building," Matias said quietly from behind him, "and you continue to interfere in my family's business, you will regret it. I can promise you that." Francisco stopped at the door but did not turn. "You ought to open that envelope again," he said. "Notice how quickly I was able to arrange that." He opened the door. "And then you should ask yourself what else I can arrange just as quickly." He departed, leaving the door open. For a long time, Matias sat by himself in the room over the dry cleaner, his hands flat on the desk, the envelope between them, his eyes fixed on the empty doorway. He was thinking, but his thoughts were pointed in the wrong direction. He was considering what he might do to Francisco Mora. He was not yet considering what Francisco Mora might do to him. That realization would arrive, but it would arrive far too late. Matias Aaron came to his decision at 11:47 that night. Francisco would later learn the exact time from an informant in the room who knew the price of accurate information given to the right person. The decision itself was simple. Matias had spent most of the day with the open door and the envelope, weighing his choices with the steady patience of a man who had complete faith in his own judgment and who had rarely seen anything to prove him wrong. By nightfall, he had his answer. Francisco Mora had entered his office, put money on his desk like he was paying a restaurant tab, dictated what he could and could not do with his own family, and then simply walked away. The money was legitimate. The math was correct. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the way he left, the open door, the distinct quality of Francisco's exit. It was unhurried and fearless. He was a man who saw no reason to look over his shoulder. Matias could not accept it. It was contrary to his very nature. He made 3 calls. Then he dispatched 4 men to Isabella's apartment on Crestfield Lane. They showed up at 12:20. 2 covered the front, and 2 covered the back. The operation was clean and synchronized, hinting that Matias's network was more sophisticated than just Derrick and his kind. The man at the front door buzzed apartment 14 first. The nameplate next to it was new, a small fact Matias's team had uncovered in less than a day. There was no response. He buzzed again. Silence. They used the rear entrance at 12:26. Apartment 14 was unoccupied, but not deserted. The furniture was all there. A single cup was next to the kitchen sink. A book was on the arm of the sofa, turned upside down, as if its reader planned to return shortly. But the small indicators of a person's immediate life, like a phone charger or a coat hanging by the door, were all gone. That collection of ordinary items that transforms a furnished space into a home had vanished. She had been relocated. The man in front called Matthias at 12:31. He reported the news in a flat, cautious voice, fully aware that the message itself would set the tone of the reply. Matthias was silent for a few seconds. Then he ordered the man to find out where she went and hung up. He sat in the darkness above the dry cleaning shop and realized, with a chilling and growing certainty, that Francisco Mora had been one step ahead of him. Isabella knew nothing about the four men until the next day. She had passed the night at another one of Francisco's nondescript properties. It was a small apartment over a printing shop on Quarry Street, with 2 rooms, decent heating, and the quiet, steady hum of the city below. Francisco had taken her there the afternoon before, not long after he got back from Pemworth Street. He told her it was just a precaution. She had seen his expression as he said it and knew it was something more, but she did not ask. She was starting to understand his way of communicating. He only said what was essential, and what was essential was always the truth, which was a novelty compared to most people she had ever trusted. She had slept. The thought surprised her. She had been sure she would lie awake, replaying the horror from Callum Street, feeling Derek's hand on her and the cold steel of the knife, reliving the pure terror of those 11 minutes. Instead, she had drifted into a heavy, dreamless sleep in under 20 minutes. It seemed her body had decided on its own that it was finally safe. The time for watching was over. A debt was being collected. Isabella awoke to a gray dawn, the scent of coffee in the air. Francisco was at the small table by the window, his phone resting on the wood. His dark eyes met hers as she stood in the doorway. He told her about the 4 men. He spoke of the empty apartment and the coordinated search, proof that Matthias's influence spread faster than one night should permit. He gave her the facts without softening them, avoiding the condescension of those who think withholding bad news is a kindness. He told her like someone announcing the weather, direct and clear, because she needed to decide how to dress for the storm. Isabella sat down, her hands wrapped around the coffee mug he had set out for her. "He is not going to stop," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "Not yet," Francisco answered. She stared into her mug. The negotiation did not work. "The negotiation revealed something important," Francisco corrected her. "He knows the debt is paid. Anything he does now cannot be disguised as business. He has to show it for what it truly is." "And what is that?" "Obsession," Francisco said. "Men who refuse to be left will often escalate when they are shown proof that they have been." He paused. "That escalation tells me exactly what I needed to know." "What did you need to know?" He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "That he is beyond reason. That our next meeting will not be a conversation." The apartment was completely silent. Outside, the city began its ordinary morning, indifferent and unaware of the crisis unfolding in 2 rooms above a print shop on Quarry Street. Isabella put her mug down. When she looked up again, her expression had changed. It was not the guarded emptiness from Callum Street, nor the broken weariness from the safe house. It was not the cautious gratitude she had shown for the last 24 hours. Something that had been missing from her face for 6 months was slowly returning. It was not quite hope. It was too soon for that. It was something tougher than hope. It was something that looked ahead instead of to the side. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Francisco thought about her question. He was used to people asking what he could do for them, what he could offer, what his protection would cost. He was not used to anyone asking what he needed. The difference was significant. "Nothing," he replied. "Stay here. Keep away from the windows." He stood and took his phone. "I have some calls to make." Isabella watched him walk to the door with the same calm, inevitable motion she first saw from 30 feet away on a foggy street, as he moved toward her through the amber twilight. "Francisco," she said. He paused and turned back. She met his gaze. Be careful. He studied her for a moment. A flicker of something moved behind his eyes, not quite surprise, but something close to it. It was the look of a man finding a variable he had not included in his plans. Then he gave a single nod and was gone. The door closed quietly. Isabella turned back to the coffee, her hands now steady on the mug. For the first time in 6 months, she started to think about what would come next. Francisco made 4 calls on his way from Quarry Street to his office on Belden Road. The first went to a man named Rohr, a handler of city records with a perfect memory for the kind of documents that groups like Matthias Ahrens create when they assume no one with purpose is looking. The second was to a woman named Petra, who ran 3 legitimate companies in the district and had, over 7 years of close watching, gained a perfect sense of which competitors were real and which were just pretending to be legitimate for the authorities. The third call was to a retired police detective named Calloway, whose departure from the force was still technically unexplained. He shared information with Francisco in a private deal that had benefited them both for longer than either would ever formally admit. The fourth call was the briefest, just 2 sentences, a name and an address. The man on the other end simply said he understood and hung up without any ceremony. Francisco slipped his phone into his pocket and walked the rest of the way to Belden Road in the calm of a city that was not yet fully awake. He had not slept. He did not seem to need it like other men, or if he did, he had trained himself to postpone that need until the situation allowed, which it did not. He took a seat at his desk in the simple, neat office above the hardware store, and he opened a folder Rohr had emailed him at 6 that morning. It contained 41 pages of financial papers, property titles, business registrations, and licensing deals. Together, they laid out the entire structure of Matthias Ahrens' operation, with the stunning detail that is only possible when someone who knows exactly where to look finally decides to do so. Francisco read through all 41 pages without a break. He made notes on 7 of them. Then he started. From the outside, it did not seem like a demolition. To anyone going about their day in the district that Wednesday, everything was normal. Deliveries came and went on time. Shops rolled up their shutters at the usual hours. People went through their routines, unaware, just focused on getting where they needed to go. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing hinted that this was the start of an end. Petra made 2 calls to suppliers who had old deals with a property management firm, one of Matthias's cleaner-looking businesses on paper. She did not make threats. She did not even say Matthias's name. She just made a different proposal, with better terms and a more dependable framework. It was the kind of long-term security that a business facing deep uncertainty could not genuinely offer. Both suppliers promised to think about it. By that afternoon, both of them had secretly switched their contracts. Calloway went to the district licensing office, holding 3 documents, and had a quiet talk with a person he had known for 11 years. By the end of the day, 2 of Matthias's businesses were flagged for a regulatory review. They were not raided or shut down, just flagged. It was the bureaucratic version of a firm hand on the shoulder, a clear message that focused, relentless attention had arrived and was not leaving. The 4 men Matthias had sent to Crestfield Lane 2 nights before discovered throughout the day that their regular contacts were suddenly gone. Not unfriendly, not warned off, just unavailable, busy, not answering, all at once focused on other things. It was the specific way people get busy when someone they trust more than you has quietly hinted that being available might be a bad idea right now. By nightfall, Matthias's operation was not ruined, but it had become conscious of itself in a completely new way. It could now feel the ground shifting beneath it. That feeling, strange and unsettling, came without a face to blame, which was exactly what Francisco wanted it to feel. Matthias felt it as well. He got the news in fragments all day. Each piece was small enough to dismiss on its own, but together they built a picture he kept trying to explain away as bad luck. But he failed to make that story stick against the growing pile of proof. A supplier went silent. A license was flagged. Two of his men could not get in touch with contacts they had depended on for years. A property inquiry was submitted by a company whose connections, when traced, all led in a single direction. By 7 that evening, he gave up pretending the events were not connected. He started making calls. He contacted men who owed him favors, men with power and influence, men whose worlds sometimes crossed paths with Francisco Moras and who, Matias figured, might have their own reasons for wanting to see his operation taken apart. He worked through his choices with the methodical calm of a man who had never faced a problem his network could not fix. Most of them listened politely. Two promised they would see what they could do. Neither of them ever called him back. Francisco drove to Pemworth Street at 9 that night. He left his car on the next street over and approached on foot. The dry cleaning shop was dark out front. The line of clothes in plastic wrap was still visible behind the glass. A light was on above the back stairway. He went in through the rear entrance and up the tight stairs. The guard who had been posted at the top yesterday was gone. The landing was empty. He pushed the door open. Matias was by himself. Francisco understood in the instant he stepped inside that this was a result of a miscalculation, not an act of bravery. The two things often look the same right before their outcomes reveal the difference. The large desk was still there. The envelope from the day before remained on its surface, opened. Its contents were set to one side with the sterile neatness of an object a man has studied many times without finding an answer. Matias was at the window when Francisco came in, his hands clasped behind him, staring down at the street below. He did not face him right away. Francisco saw the performance for what it was, the confident man taking in his surroundings, refusing to be rushed by a visitor. He allowed him to finish. Matias finally turned. His face looked different than it had the day before. The solid frame of confidence that had shaped his every expression during their first meeting, from the controlled smile to the authority of the large desk, now showed clear signs of stress. It had not collapsed, but it was like a structure bearing too much weight, the materials beginning to give way from the inside. "You have been busy," Matias said. "I suggested you think about what I could organize quickly," Francisco replied, walking to the middle of the room. "I wanted you to have a demonstration. Suppliers, licensing issues, a few conversations." Matias kept his voice even. "This is not over." "No," Francisco concurred. "It is not. That is your decision." He met the other man's eyes without emotion, without any show of aggression. "The flags on your licenses are only the start. Your property records are being looked at by people who will discover exactly what they are meant to, because I have shown them exactly where to dig. Your entire business depends on the belief that any official attention it gets is random and can be managed. The attention I am bringing is targeted and relentless. I can keep this pressure up for as long as it takes." He paused. "Your operation cannot survive it. The math is simple." Matias said nothing. The room around him was silent. It was the heavy silence of a man whose mind was racing, trying to find a way out that his face could no longer hide. "You are doing all of this," he said, "for a woman who did not even know who you were 4 days ago." "She requested my help," Francisco said. "I am giving it to her. That is the entire reason." He let the statement settle. "Leave the district by morning. Do not come back. The pieces of your business that are left can crumble without my help. That is my proposal. It will not get any better." Something changed on Matias's face. It was not anger. Anger would have been simple to read, but this was more complex and far more devastating. It was the look of a man who chased one goal so intensely that he never saw what the chase did to him. He never saw the parts of himself he destroyed for something that was never love and could never be love. He turned his head away. Francisco gave him 2 seconds. Then he walked to the door, his steps steady and sure, the same way he had moved since Callum Street. He never looked back and said nothing more. From behind, he heard Matias let out a long, strained breath. It was the sound of a building giving way to a weight it could no longer support. Down on the street, the city carried on with its normal night. Matthias Aaron was gone from the district by midnight. He carried a single bag. He did not tell the men who still worked for him. He said goodbye to no one, because when he looked at his life with honesty, there was no one left to tell. He never came back. Francisco showed up at Quarry Street at 8 the next morning. He gave 2 quick knocks, a pattern Isabella had learned to recognize instinctively over the last few days. The small, ordinary detail made her pause. She realized her entire idea of normal had been rebuilt around this new reality. She opened the door. He walked in holding 2 coffees from the shop on the corner. He placed one down for her with his usual calm purpose. He sat at the table and told her that Matthias had disappeared. The organization had shattered the moment he left. In Francisco's world, loyalty only lasted as long as the system that paid for it was still standing. The men who had been sent to Crestfield Lane were gone. The official warnings on the business licenses were still active. The suppliers never came back. The property investigations were moving forward and would finish on their own. Francisco's involvement was no longer needed. It was over. Isabella sat at the table, holding her coffee cup with both hands. She took in the news the way she had learned to take in everything these past 6 months. She examined it carefully from every direction before she let herself believe it. She had been let down by promises before. She had built herself up with relief, only to find the ground beneath her was temporary. But Francisco was not a temporary person. She knew that about him after the second day. "He is not coming back," she stated. "No." She gave a slow nod. She put the cup down and felt something she did not expect and could never have imagined. It was not the huge release she might have pictured. There were no tears, no sudden wave of relief that had finally arrived after a long wait. Instead, there was a deep and unsettling quiet. It was like a noise that had been there for so long she no longer heard it, a noise that had become the very feeling of silence. And now that it was gone, what remained was not quite peace. It was the foundation for peace, a space that did not exist before. She did not know what to do with it at first. Francisco drank his coffee and did not try to fill the quiet with words. This was another thing she had learned about him. He never saw silence as an issue that needed to be fixed. He existed in it the same way he existed in a room. He was not sorry for it. He did not act like a man who was afraid of being still. After a moment, she spoke. "I am still waiting for the other shoe to drop." "What other shoe?" "The catch," she said. "The price that comes after the rescue. There is always a price that comes after." She held his gaze. "You cleared his debt. You relocated me 2 times. You have spent 4 days taking his entire business apart." She stopped. "No one does all of that without expecting payment." Francisco listened to her words with the focus she knew he gave to things that mattered. He did not rush to calm her fears. He did not offer a quick, practiced denial like a man with a ready answer. He simply sat with her question. "My sister's name was Camilla," he said. Isabella froze. She was deaf. "I learned sign language so I could speak with her." He slid his coffee cup in a small circle on the table. "She died at 19 years old. The situation involved a man who thought her inability to hear his approach meant she was his for the taking." His voice showed no trace of sadness. It was direct and plain. He described everything that way, which somehow gave his words more power than if he had been emotional. "I was not able to help her. I was in another city. By the time I found out, it was too late to do anything." The apartment on Callum Street was silent. He said, "You used her language when you asked for help, and I was there to hear it." He looked right at her. "That is the entire reason for my actions. There is no price attached." Isabella met his gaze for a long time. She studied him the same way she did on Callum Street after he signed, "You are safe." She was trying to make sense of something that did not belong in any of her known worlds. "I am so sorry," she said softly. "For Camila." He gave a single nod, accepting her words without argument or excuse. She reached over to the envelope he had left on the table the day before. The one she had not opened. The one she had not touched. She turned it over in her hands. "For my life," she said, saying his own words back to him. "Not for you, not for me," he repeated. She placed it on the table. She did not open it, but she also did not slide it back to him. Francisco understood this was her way of accepting it. "I will pay you back," she said. "It is not because I have to, it is because I choose to." A tiny change happened in his expression, a shift that occurred at the edges of his face, not the center. "If it is important to you," he replied. "It is." He nodded. He took his coffee. Outside, the morning went about its business. It was unchanging and endless. It made no room for the fact that something had just ended in the 2 rooms above the print shop on Quarry Street, or that something new, fragile and unspoken, had just started. "What am I supposed to do now?" Isabella asked. Her tone was not helpless, but practical. It was the question of a person looking at an empty plot of land and starting to think about what to build. Francisco watched her from across the table. He saw the woman who had survived 11 minutes of terror on a rainy street. The woman who found the strength in the final second to speak the one language that could save her. She had sat in this safe house and told him the entire truth, hiding nothing. On that first morning, she had asked what he needed. Almost no one ever asked him that, and he still was not sure what to do with the question. "You already know," he finally said. She met his eyes without flinching. Then her gaze fell to the table. A change moved across her face, quiet and without any drama, the way the most important things often happen. It was like a curtain opening in a room that had been dark for years. Light fell on everything that was still there, still hers, still possible to reclaim. She almost smiled. "Live well," she said, trying the words out, feeling their shape. He held her gaze. "That is enough." Isabella went back to her apartment on Crestfield Lane on a Thursday. She rode the bus instead of a taxi. It was a small, practical choice, but it meant she had to sit with strangers and not study every single face. It meant not choosing a seat near the exit. It meant turning off the constant, quiet math of survival that had run in her head for 6 months. She watched the city slide past the window. She tried the strange new skill of just looking at things without searching for a threat. It was more difficult than she imagined, but easier than she had feared. She let herself into the building and walked up to the 3rd floor. She put her key in the lock of apartment 14. She stood in the doorway for a moment, not checking for danger, but looking at what was left. The furniture was all in its place. The gray light filtered through curtains she had pulled shut the night Derek showed up on Grayford Road. A book was still on the arm of the sofa, face down, exactly where she had put it in the final, ordinary second before her life split into before and after. She walked to the sofa and picked up the book. She looked at the page she had been on, but remembered none of it. She could not say what sentence she was reading when the knock came. She placed the book on the side table, this time facing up. Then she opened the curtains. Light filled the room. It was an ordinary Thursday light, not dramatic, just enough. It covered the furniture and the floor, the small, quiet map of a life that had been stopped and was now starting again. She stood at the window and looked down at the street. A woman carried a shopping bag. 2 men were talking outside the newsstand. A child was pulling on a parent's hand, trying to go towards something more interesting. No one was watching her building. No car was waiting. No one was taking notes on who came and went from the main door. It was just a street being a street, alive and unconcerned with her. She let herself feel all of it. She did not rush to the next thought. It took more time than she expected. Safety, she was learning, did not arrive all at once. It moved in slowly. It claimed its space room by room, day by day. It was there the first morning she made coffee and did not listen for footsteps on the stairs. It was there the first night she fell asleep without analyzing every sound from outside. It built up in small, quiet ways, until one day she realized it was simply the air she breathed, not something she had to build herself. She signed up for the event management class at Ferris Street College. The application took 40 minutes. She sat at her kitchen table, filled in every box, and sent it before she could think of a reason not to. The part of her that made lists of reasons not to had kept her small and safe for 6 months. She was done letting that part of her lead. She started running in the mornings, not to run away from anything. She did not run from the nervous need to move to manage her fear. She ran because the streets in the early morning were quiet, and they were hers. She had been inside for long enough. She called her sister, who she had not been honest with in 8 months, and she told her almost all of the truth. Not everything. Some of it was not her story to tell yet, but she told her enough. Her sister cried. Isabella did not, and that was a surprise to both of them. She did not see Francisco in those days. She knew he was in the city. The machinery of his world was working on the same streets she now walked on more and more easily. But he did not look for her, and she had started to see this as a sign of respect, not of absence. He had done the thing he said he would do. He was not the sort of man who needed to be thanked for it over and over. She thought of him in a different way than she thought about the other parts of that time. Derek, the knife, Matthias, the 11 minutes on Callum Street. She worked through these things the way people work through trauma. It did not happen in a straight line. It happened in pieces. She would return to them until they became a part of her story, instead of an interruption to it. They were heavy, but she could carry them now. They no longer carried her. Francisco was in a box she had never needed to make before. He was not a savior. She did not like that word. It made something that was more equal feel one-sided. He was a person who had been paying the right kind of attention at exactly the right time. He had chosen, without pausing and without conditions, to do something about what he saw. It was the rare, specific gift of being understood in the language you were actually speaking by a person who could answer you. She saw him on a Tuesday. She was walking out of Ferris Street College with a folder tucked under her arm. She felt that good kind of tired that comes after a productive afternoon. He was on the other side of the street, in his black suit, walking toward Belden Road. He noticed her before she noticed him. She knew this because when she looked up from her bag, he was already still. He was looking across the street at her with that calm focus that was just his way of dealing with things that were important. She stopped walking, too. They stood on opposite sides of the street. Traffic flowed between them, not caring. She could see the tattoos at his collar and on his hands, even from that far away. The black suit, the stillness of a man who was exactly where he needed to be. She thought of Callum Street. She thought of her fingers moving in the folds of her wet skirt, of the 4 seconds she had measured and then used. She adjusted the folder under her arm, lifted her free hand, and in the gap between 2 passing cars, she made the shapes. They were clear, slow, and confident, not like the desperate rushed signs of that night. Her fingers were not moving between heartbeats anymore. This was something she was giving, not something she was stealing from the edge of fear. Thank you. Francisco looked at her hands, and then he looked at her face. His expression did not change the way most people's do. There was no big show of warmth, no smile for the moment. But something shifted in his eyes, quiet and real. It was the private shift of a man who feels things he has long ago learned not to show. His right hand came up. The tattooed fingers moved without hurry. They were fluent. It was the ease of a language that had never left his hands, not in all the years since a little girl with dark eyes first showed him that silence was not a lack of a voice, but just another way of speaking. Live well. Isabella looked at his hands, and then at his face. She met his eyes across the busy street for a moment that was not short and not long. It was just complete. It was exactly as long as it needed to be. She nodded one time. Then she turned and walked up Ferris Street in the afternoon sun, her folder under her arm. Her steps had a quality she had been slowly winning back, day by day. It was the quality of a person walking towards something, something not yet finished, open, and worth the walk. She did not look back. On his side of the street, Francisco stood until she went around the corner and was out of sight. He did not move right away. He stood there on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon with his hands by his sides, and he let the moment be what it was. Complete. Enough. It did not need anything added to it. He thought of Kama for a second, the way he always did at times like this. It was not with the heavy feeling of loss, which he had learned to hold without letting it control him. It was something softer. Maybe it was thankfulness. Thankfulness that the language she had given him had traveled through all the years and all the miles, from that quiet, lamp-lit bedroom to this street, and found someone who needed it. He put his hands in his pockets and kept walking. The street went on behind him. The cobblestones were still wet from a rain that had passed. The street lamps were not on yet in the afternoon light. The city moved on with its normal Thursday business, with the complete lack of interest of something too big and too old to notice single stories. But the stories were still there. They were in the spaces between things. They were in the silence between words. They were in the movement of fingers that said what a voice could not. On a foggy street at the last possible second. They are always there, for anyone who is paying the right kind of attention. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. You are the reason that these stories feel real. If you are ready for another story that will move you, just tap on the next video on your screen. And before you leave, please write a quick comment and give this story a rating from 1 to 10. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and inspiration to our audience.